How do you tell the story of a street? Is it through the bricks and mortar or through the hands that laid them? Is it through a building's physical changes over time or the people and events who change them? I think that all of these stories are important. They are all interconnected and interdependent. Some are easier to find than others. Buildings, even ones long gone, tend to leave obvious and tangible evidence, things we can touch and feel. Most people, however, echo more quietly through history. Their voices often lost forever, and their stories forgotten. In this episode, I'm going to try and unearth some forgotten stories of the people who built, lived, worked and played on one single street in the city of Leeds. Together with East Street Arts, Leeds City Council and Historic England as part of the High Street Heritage Action Zone project. Let's explore New Briggate. The first obvious question, to me anyway, is just how new is New Briggate? Well, in comparison to its original name giver, Briggate, it seems to merit its new label. Briggate is one of the oldest streets in the city, with history going back nearly a millennia. New Briggate, however, under that name anyway, appears around the 1860s, when an existing street was significantly widened. Prior to this, it was known as St. John Street, borrowing from St. John's Church at its northern end. Leap back another 70 years to the start of the 19th century, and it was, according to a pamphlet published in 1800, known as New Street End. The Leeds Times stumbled upon a copy of the pamphlet in 1869 and were kind enough to write an article about it in their May 15th edition, nestled at the bottom of page 5. Then, a few weeks later, on the 28th of May 1869, a letter, published this time in the Leeds Mercury, sheds further light on New Briggate's beginnings. Gentlemen, in going along New Briggate tonight, I was glad to see that progress was being made in the alterations, part of the paving and flagging having already been finished. I was surprised, however, at the absence of standards for gas lamps. If these are not prepared, we shall find that, as soon as the road is finished, it will be opened up again to fix up the gas standards. Is this an oversight on part of the council in letting the contracts? Or are the gas companies to blame for not putting them up before the road is finished? I am, gentlemen, yours, A. Ratepayer. May 27th, 1869. It is a frequent delight to me how often I am able to confirm a detail of a story I'm researching by finding a disgruntled letter in a newspaper. But what was lost to make way for New Briggate? Well, the original Corn Exchange was there, just left of the narrow entrance to the older, smaller St. John Street. The need for a replacement Corn Exchange had been highlighted by the town for a while, and it was, of course, young Cuthbert Broderick's famed domed Palace of Light, which replaced it in 1862, and still stands today, just a few hundred metres from its original spot. It's likely a culmination of factors, tipped by the original Corn Exchange's demolition, which drove the development of New Briggate. Towards the end of the old St. John Street, facing opposite the stepped entrance to the church, was St. John's Vicarage. Just to the north of those, where the Grand Theatre now stands, were a collection of almshouses, mill ponds and reservoirs, stone and wood yards. It was a place for work, not play. Tightly packed yards ran perpendicular to the hedgerow, often cramming people into poor living conditions. The almshouses, charitable housing provided to those in need, are shown on the 1861 census as being occupied by a group of elderly widows. The prevalence of women in such accommodation at the time is reflective of the woefully limited job opportunities for older women, as a slower-paced, artisanal economy of home working rapidly gave way to a fast-moving industrial one. New Brigate's creation represented a wider shift happening in the newly crowned city of Leeds. Mass transit was now at the front of the mind of the urban planner. As the city's population rapidly grew, the key consideration needed to be how this population got to where they needed to go. As independent working from the same place you often lived began to decline, a new generation of workers were pioneering something we take for granted today: the commute. New Briggate was as much about getting people to where they needed to go as it was giving them a new destination. A short article in March 25th, 1876 Leeds Mercury begins to shape the street we'd recognise today. New Theatre in Leeds. We understand that the land in New Briggate, at present occupied by Mr. Adams' circus, and at the back land occupied by the temporary stables of the tramway company, have been purchased for the site of a new theatre. The site has a frontage to New Briggate of 161 feet and to Harrison Street of 212 feet and contains nearly 4,000 yards. It is proposed to have the principal entrances from New Briggate and to utilise the remaining frontage for first-class shops and other business premises. The theatre will accommodate over 3,000 people, and the stage will be one of the largest in the kingdom. The construction of the building is to be, as far as possible, fireproof. Mr. Corson is the architect employed. And the mention of the tramway company stables is a nice reminder that trams were still horse-drawn at this point. And what is Mr. Adams' circus? And despite the myriad of awful and potentially cruel Victorian events that entered my mind, it sounds innocently enough like a family circus. Another article from the Leeds Mercury from 1876 describes admirable feats of horsemanship displayed by both male and female riders, whilst the clowns are as amusing and agile as ever. And by the turn of the 20th century, New Briggate had established itself as a busy commercial street. Tram lines had been laid connecting from Hedgerow to North Street, allowing travel to Meanwood, Chapeltown, Hare Hills and Roundhay. And the gas lighting on the street began to give way to electric lighting. The trams evolved from horse-drawn to electric power. New Briggate represented the missing puzzle piece in the city's north-south traffic flow. Even after the tram network was lost in the late 50s, the street became a crucial bus corridor until very recently. Over a century of people waiting for public transport on this short stretch of road. Along with the Grand Theatre were many new commercial residents. Occupying numbers 8 to 10 New Brigates prior to the Hedgerow's expansion in the 1930s was J.H. Ormack, glass, china and silverware merchant. Operating since the 1880s, Ormack's not only sold but hired out their goods. It seems as though many famous makers of the day, like Gray's Pottery in Stoke-on-Trent, made goods specifically for Ormack's. Pop online and you'll find a wealth of beautiful vintage china and silverware bearing the Made for Ormack's mark. My favourite I've seen is a commemorative plate for King Edward VII's coronation, bearing the coronation's original and now incorrect date of the 26th of June 1902. King Edward was diagnosed with appendicitis 2 days before and had to undergo what was then radical surgery, delaying the coronation until August. The New Briggate Arcade Company had also finished building the Grand Arcade next to the theatre. In 1920, one of the arcade's most famous residents was born, the Tower Picture House. Its grand opening in April was, according to the Leeds Mercury, attended by an audience of an auspicious size, and there were many favourable comments upon what is a notable addition to the central cinemas of Leeds. The cinema's new and very capable orchestra was conducted by Mr. P. Jacobs, who had apparently been a conductor of several army orchestras. It still amazes me to think that once a film's soundtrack was played live by an orchestra as standard. The cinema's new manager also came from a military background, which might seem unusual until you remember that the First World War had just finished, and the Boer War not long before that. There were millions of former servicemen all returning to a new normality, once again free to pursue their passions. Tower Picture House, however, wasn't the only cinema to grace the street. The Grand Assembly Rooms, on the right-hand side of the Grand Theatre entrance, had been used to screen silent films from around 1903. It was in 1923, however, that the building was given a dramatic refurbishment, turning it into a beautiful classical cinema, initially known as Assembly Room Cinema. In 1958, the cinema changed hands and became known as the Plaza. This is the name that has lingered on through the decades and is often the subject of local memory. The Plaza, I'm unsure exactly when, developed a reputation for showing B-movies and risque continental films. Eventually, by the 1980s, it seemed to be almost exclusively showing what was thought of at the time as pornography. Unsurprisingly, I can find little mention of the cinema in traditional sources. Journalists seem to avoid discussing it in the local press. Indeed, one of the very few newspaper articles I could find is from the Sunday Mirror in 1980, where, unbelievably, nestled between a half-naked model wearing a fur coat and an advert for socks, is an article describing how women participating in a Reclaim the Night march in Leeds, in response to Peter Sutcliffe's 13th murder of a woman in the area, stormed the Plaza Cinema, amongst many others in the city. The article is flippant at best. Half of it talks about a clairvoyant who's travelled up from Kent convinced they'd solved the case. It is a violent reminder of how unheard women's voices were as recently as 1980. That every newspaper, every television report, almost every official recorded source was almost exclusively the thoughts and opinions of men and men alone. The 1930s saw the southern entrance of the street change entirely via Sir Reginald Blumfeld's grand redevelopment of the hedgerow, again with the aim of increasing traffic flow, this time east to west. Two titans now sat at either side of New Brigate's entrance. Lewis's department store on the left, and the Paramount, soon to become Odeon Theatre, on its right. Rising up in red brick and Portland stone, both saw out the rest of the century together, closing in 1996 and 2001 respectively. Both buildings thankfully survive, now occupied by the likes of HomeSense and Sports Direct. And some of you might be wondering about the street's oldest resident, now hidden by the newer buildings around it. On the west side of the street, just after the junction with Mark Lane, under the shade of two large ash trees, is the unmistakable stone-arched entrance of St. John the Evangelist Church. Rising up the steps and passing under the arch brings you up and away from the busy street below and into a tranquil green paradise. It is not only the oldest church in the city, but one of the earliest examples of Leeds stretching out of its medieval boundary, the northern end having traditionally been the hedgerow. It has an importance which echoes beyond Leeds, being one of the very few churches built under Charles I before the country descended into civil war. It is also the best surviving legacy of John Harrison, who not only built the church but cultivated the surrounding area with its almhouses and charity school, the latter of which still survives today, being the home of Age UK Leeds. The inside of the church is a rich chorus of Jacobean woodwork, carefully restored by Temple Lushington Moore from 1890. Fascinatingly, despite John Harrison's many acts of charity towards the people of Leeds, and the church's obvious great beauty today, for much of its early life it was frequently spoken ill of, certainly from an architectural standpoint. Thomas Whitaker, in his revised edition of Ducatus Leodiensis, declared that it had all the gloom and all the obstructions of an ancient church without one vestige of its dignity and grace. In my opinion, it is likely Harrison's perceived support of the royal cause during the Civil War and his lifetime of overt generosity that fostered what we would today call haters. I'm sure to many elites in the 17th century, charity was to be viewed with great suspicion. At the northern end of the street are more local landmarks. The Wren's Hotel has stood at the intersection of New Briggate, Merrion Street and Cross Belgrave Street since 1880 and was named after its original owner, Alfred Wren. Its close proximity to the Grand Theatre made it a convenient place for people performing in the shows to stay, and the bar providing a convenient watering hole for the people attending them. Just further north is Belgrave Chapel and its slightly later Sunday school. Today, Belgrave Music Hall occupies the Sunday school building. The chapel, which stood on the right, is much less obvious to me. Now called Belgrave Hall, the building underwent conversion and restoration in 1991, communicated only by a stone engraving hidden around the side. It's clear to me anyway that the building underwent such extensive conversion that it's very hard to believe it was a chapel, and that it predates the Sunday school on the left of it by a fair amount. Indeed, the current footprint of the building seems significantly smaller when compared to old Ordnance Survey maps. If you can shed any light on this mystery, please let me know. I suppose this loosely brings us up to today, where New Briggate, despite being one of the shortest streets in the city, presents an interesting dichotomy of truths. The east side of the street, with the Grand Arcade and Theatre, is undoubtedly beautiful. The west side it faces, mere feet away, is in a more complicated situation. Conservation on one side gives way to a real lack of it on the other. And this is why conservation legislation is so important in the right places. Otherwise, over decades of commercial use, it's totally unavoidable that things get messy. Luckily, this hasn't gone unnoticed. In November of 2017, Leeds City Council published its Conservation Area Appraisal and Management Plan for the Grand Quarter, identifying New Briggate and its immediate surroundings as an area of special character and historic interest. The key aims of its proposal are music to my ears: protection and enhancement of special and historical features using positive conservation management of the area. But what does this mean? Essentially, it means setting some rules and boundaries, ensuring that shop frontage respects the character of the building, that any work done on the building preserves heritage features or even uncovers hidden ones. It's not just all backwards-looking romanticism. The area is a historic green spot in an otherwise highly urban area. Let's harness that to sculpt a more climate-friendly, forward-thinking area. The rundown west side of New Briggate, redubbed the Grand Parade, could be transformed much like Kirkgate with a heritage-led regeneration shopfront scheme. The High Street Heritage Action Zone project has attracted a further £1.3 million of funding from Historic England, which is being match-funded by the council. As opposed to a lot of recent city construction focusing on highway improvements and public realm creation, this project actively seeks to protect and restore historic buildings and spaces. The end goal being to stop the street simply being somewhere to catch a bus from, and maybe to start becoming somewhere you catch a bus to instead. Where more people know the joy of a short stroll around St. John's beautiful gardens. Where more people know to look up just above the shop line and feast their eyes on a myriad of period architectural features. Where more people just know the history, both good and bad. And finally, the most important thing about any street is that it is a shared space. In a time that sees us leading increasingly private lives, it is important not to overlook a simple principle: that any decisions we make about our public spaces are decisions that we all share and that we all have to live with, yet that do not affect us all equally. Some of us rely on these public spaces more than others, and all too often have a much quieter or unheard voice on any potential changes. Our public spaces should work just as well for our most vulnerable citizens as they should our most affluent ones. Thank you so much for listening to this special episode of Leeds Echoes. I'd like to thank East Street Arts, Leeds City Council and Historic England for both their support and trust in making it. In the meantime, stay safe, take care, and love where you live.